I'm not the kind of person who rushes into things headfirst. I'd always preferred to think things through, to be careful and cautious about every decision. But when I met Emma, all that went away. She was everything I never knew she could be: smart, funny, ambitious, and insanely beautiful. The way she could light up a room made me feel like I was the luckiest guy in the world. We met at a mutual friend's housewarming party. I wasn't even supposed to be there, but I was talked into going by my buddy Jeff, who said I needed to get out more. He wasn't wrong. My dating life was pretty dry. Emma walked in wearing a cobalt blue dress that made her look like she had just stepped out of a movie. I couldn't take my eyes off her, but I didn't have the courage to approach her right away. Turns out I didn't have to. She came up to me, asked me if I was the guy who stole the cheese plate, and in an instant we were laughing and talking like old friends. We hit it off right away. By the end of the evening, we had exchanged numbers, and I couldn't stop thinking about her. Our relationship grew rapidly. It was the kind of whirlwind romance you only hear about in movies. Within 6 months, we were already living together. By the 9th month, I was already shopping for a ring. My friends warned me that I was in too much of a hurry. Jeff, the same guy who encouraged me to go to that party, tried to talk some sense into me. "She's awesome," he said, "but have you thought about how this is all going to work out in the long run? After all, you barely know her." "Yeah, but when you do, I told him. And I meant it. Emma had been frank with me about her financial situation from the beginning. She told me she had credit card debt, but she said it wasn't a big deal. "Just a few bad decisions in college," she said, brushing it off. I estimated that we were talking about a couple $1,000s. Nothing we couldn't handle. We got married a year after we met. It wasn't a lavish wedding. We couldn't afford it. But it was perfect in its own way. We promised each other forever. And for a while, it felt like we were living in a fairy tale. And then reality set in. The first crack in the perfect life I envisioned came when we sat down at the table to get our finances together. That's when I learned that Emma's small credit card debt was approaching $40,000. I remember feeling like I was blown away by the wind. I tried to stay calm, but things were swirling inside of me. "This is more than I expected," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I know," she replied, looking genuinely remorseful. "But now that we're a team, we can get through this together." Her optimism was contagious, and I told myself we'd make it through. So, we set to work. We made a strict budget, cut back on unnecessary expenses, and took on extra hours at work. Emma promised me that she was totally on board, and for a while, I thought we were making progress. But the thing is, cracks don't just disappear. They spread. About 6 months into our debt repayment plan, I started noticing minor annoyances. Emma would come home later than usual, saying she had to stay late at work. She would mention going out with friends for drinks, but when I asked who with, her answers were vague. I tried not to think about it. After all, she was working hard, just like me. Then the credit card charges started showing up again. At first it was little things, going to a coffee shop, takeout, online shopping. I'd ask her about it, and she always had an explanation. "I just needed a refresher," or "It's work-related. I'll splurge later." I wanted to believe her, so I let it go. But then the expenses got bigger. Dinner at an expensive steakhouse, designer clothes, concert tickets. We had agreed to live a no-frills lifestyle until we got out of debt, so it didn't make sense. When I brought it up, she brushed me off. "It's no big deal, babe. Don't worry about it." But I was stressing out. A lot. I started looking more closely at our finances, and the more I looked, the more discrepancies I found. One evening, she came home smelling of expensive perfume that I knew she didn't have. When I asked her about it, she laughed. "It's just from someone at work. You're paranoid." Maybe I was. Or maybe I wasn't. The real turning point came a few weeks later when I found a check in her car. It was a check for dinner at a fancy Italian restaurant, one we'd never been to, the night she was supposedly working late. My heart dropped when I looked at it. I didn't say anything right away. Instead, I started looking deeper. I combed through her social media, checked our joint credit card statements, and even looked at her texts when she left her phone unlocked. That's when I found the messages. There weren't many, but there were enough to figure out what was going on. She was seeing someone, a young guy, as far as I could tell, and she was using our money to spoil him. The realization hit me like a freight train. While I was working hard to pay off my debts, she was having fun with someone else. I felt like the biggest idiot in the world. That night I didn't argue with her. I needed time to think about my next move. But one thing was clear. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I had sacrificed so much for, was not who she said she was. When Emma and I first got married, I thought we were invincible. Sure, there were challenges. We didn't start out in the best financial situation. But I believed in us. I believed in the idea of teamwork makes dreams come true. As cheesy as that sounds. If anyone could tackle a $40,000 debt together, it was us. At least that's what I thought at the time. We made a plan, one of those hyper-organized budgets where every penny had a purpose. We cut everything. No more takeout, no more weekend trips, no more random Amazon orders that made life a little easier but also a little more expensive. I even sold my old games console, and Emma got rid of a pile of clothes she never wore but swore she was saving up for the right occasion. It wasn't easy, but for a while we felt like we were making progress, not just financially, but as a couple. There was something strangely satisfying about the way we solved problems together. On Friday nights, instead of going out, we'd sit at the kitchen table with a couple beers and tally up the numbers, celebrating small victories, like paying off one of her small credit cards. I'd look across the table at her and feel an overwhelming sense of pride, not just for myself, but for her, for us. Emma had always had an infectious optimism. When things seemed impossible, she would remind me of how far we'd come. "Look at this," she'd say, pointing to our spreadsheet. "We're killer. Soon we'll be debt-free." Her enthusiasm kept me going even when I was exhausted, working overtime, or giving up desirable things like upgrading my truck, or going on a weekend fishing trip with my buddies. For a while, I felt the sacrifices were worth it. We had it together. But then cracks started to appear. Not in the plan itself, but in the way it felt. At first, I wrote it off to stress. We worked insane amounts of hours, hardly ever went out, and spent most of our free time obsessing over money. Who wouldn't feel a little burned out? It started with little things. Emma would come home with small purchases she didn't have money for. A pair of shoes on sale, a bottle of wine for a treat, or a new purse that she swore she needed because her old one was falling apart. I didn't pay much attention to it at first. We were doing well overall, and I didn't want to seem controlling. But deep down, it annoyed me. I was giving up a lot, and she didn't feel like she was doing the same. Then there were the work walks. Emma worked in marketing, and it seemed that this field required constant socializing. She started going out more often, saying it was for networking or team building. "It's just part of the job," she'd tell me when I'd raise an eyebrow at the sight of another $80 dinner that wasn't in the budget. I wanted to trust her, so I didn't push too hard. But I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. The turning point came about a year after our plan began. We had just paid off her biggest credit card, and I felt a huge sense of relief. For the first time, it felt like the finish line was within reach. I suggested we mark the occasion with a nice dinner, something small but meaningful. Emma agreed, but when the evening came, she declined at the last minute, saying she had to meet a client for a drink. I remember sitting at home that evening, eating microwave food alone, and wondering if I'd lost my mind in frustration. After all, she worked hard too. Maybe I wasn't being fair? But then I remembered all those times I turned down my buddies because I wanted to stay afloat. All those weekends I'd spent moonlighting at work while she was online. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that we were just going through a rough patch. Every marriage has them, right? Yet I couldn't shake the growing sense of imbalance. I was killing myself trying to stick to the plan, while Emma seemed to have a lot more leeway. I started watching our bank statements more closely, but not because I didn't trust her, but because I needed to make sure we were still on track. That's when I noticed the expenses. Small ones at first, cafes, lunches, the occasional boutique purchase. Then the bigger ones started to show up, dinners at expensive restaurants, spa treatments, a designer bag that I knew wasn't part of our agreement. I brought it up with her, and she became defensive. "I'm the one who has to go to work and keep up appearances," she snapped back. "You don't understand how it is in my industry." I didn't know what to say to that. Maybe she was right. Maybe I didn't understand. But something about the way she brushed off my concerns made me uncomfortable. Looking back, I realized that it was at that moment that I should have acted more decisively, trusted my intuition. But I didn't want to be the husband who doubted his wife. I wanted to believe that we were still together. Instead, I buried my anxiety and immersed myself even more deeply in our plan. I worked longer hours, skipped more walks, and told myself it would all be worth it once we were debt-free. Emma seemed happy, and I convinced myself that's what mattered. But the cracks weren't going away. What's more, they were getting bigger. And I began to realize that no amount of financial planning could fix them. By the time we reached our goal and paid off Emma's last debt, I felt like I had climbed Mount Everest. It was exhausting, grueling, and at times seemed impossible, but we did it. I emphasized that word in my head because I truly believed we were a team. We celebrated with a modest dinner at our favorite burger joint. Nothing fancy, but it was nice to treat ourselves for the first time in what seemed like forever. Emma was in a great mood, laughing and talking about how happy she was to finally have her freedom. "You deserve it," I told her, and I really meant it. But as the weeks passed, I began to notice something I hadn't expected. Emma envisioned freedom very differently than I did. While I was still focused on economy and simplicity, she seemed to have switched to a completely different wavelength. She started going out more often, dinners out, drinks, weekend trips with friends. She assured me that it was all fine, but the expenses started piling up again. I tried to talk to her about it, but she brushed me off, saying she was just enjoying the fruits of our labor. "We worked so hard for this," she said. "Don't you think we deserve to have a little fun?" I wanted to agree. I wanted to be happy for her. But something about the way she was spending her time, so carefree, so detached from the sacrifices we'd made, wasn't right. It was as if she was waiting for this moment, not to build a better future together, but to start living a life I had no part in. And in the back of my mind, I began to question whether I even knew her at all. When you live with a person long enough, you start to notice patterns. You know their habits, the way they act in life. Emma had always been a bit of a free spirit when it came to spending, but mostly she restrained herself while we paid off her debt. That's why it caught my attention when my credit card bills started going up again. It started with a couple of payments I didn't recognize, nothing major, just a coffee shop I didn't know she frequented, and a $20 book from an online store. At first I brushed it off. After all, we have no debt now. Maybe she just wanted to treat herself. But then more serious allegations came to light. The first one that really stood out was from a swanky Italian restaurant downtown. The name of the place was familiar to me because I'd walked past it a few times, and I had to look twice at the prices on the menu posted outside. Emma and I never went to places like that, even when we were dating. I considered asking her, but decided it was probably a work dinner or something. The next week another bill came, this time for an expensive department store. Emma wasn't the type to buy designer clothes, or at least she hadn't since we started our financial journey. I told myself it must be a gift for someone in the family or an upcoming special occasion. But the expenses didn't stop. They started coming more frequently. Dinner bills that seemed suspiciously high for one person, boutique purchases, and a spa day I knew nothing about. Each bill eroded my confidence, like a tiny crack in a dam I'd been building for years. One evening as we sat on the couch, I decided to broach the subject in passing. "Hey, I noticed there was a bill from Bellaroma on the card last week. Was it work-related?" Emma barely looked up from her phone. "Yeah, we had a team dinner. You know how it is." "Team dinner," I repeated, nodding. I didn't push it. I wanted to believe her, but something about the way she said it didn't feel right. A few days later, I saw another bill, this time for an expensive wine bar. When I asked her about it, she said she was treating her coworkers to thank them for a big project. "You're treating them? Isn't that what your boss is supposed to do?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. She sighed and looked at me with that look that said I was being unreasonable. "Babe, it's networking. In my field, things like this matter." I brushed it off again. She was probably right. I wasn't in marketing. I didn't know how things worked in her world. But the little voice in my head didn't want to shut up. The turning point came about a month later when I received a notification from my credit card company about a large purchase. I logged in to check my bill and saw that $300 had been spent on a visit to a luxury spa downtown, the kind you go to when you want a massage that costs more than your monthly car payment. I waited until Emma got home that night. She walked in, smiling and carrying a shopping bag. "Hi," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I got a credit card charge alert. Did you go to the Serenity Spa today?" She froze for a second, barely noticeable, but enough for me to catch it. Then she smiled. "Oh yes. It was a gift for my assistant. She's been working her ass off lately, and I wanted to show her my appreciation." "Your assistant?" "Yes, my assistant," she said, a little more sharply this time. I nodded, pretending to buy it, but something inside clicked. None of this was adding up. Emma didn't have an assistant, at least not that I'd ever heard of. And even if she did, who spends $300 on a spa day for someone they work with? The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I'd always trusted Emma, but the more I ran the recent expenses through my head, the more anxious I felt. I started going through old credit card statements, checking every amount I didn't immediately recognize. What I discovered only made matters worse. Several months ago, there had been charges for dinner, and always at places Emma and I never went. A boutique store I'd never heard of. A set of concert tickets for a band I didn't even like. And the ever-recurring expense of a travel app, even though we had 2 cars. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but my intuition was screaming at me. Something wasn't right. That night I brought it up again. "Emma, I've been looking at the credit card statements, and there are a lot of charges I don't recognize. Are you sure it's all for work?" Her smile wavered, just for a second. "Of course it is. Why are you even asking?" "I don't know. It just seems like a lot." The expression on her face hardened. "What are you trying to say? That I'm lying to you?" "No, I'm not saying that. I don't know, Emma. It doesn't make sense." She rolled her eyes and ran out of the room, muttering something about me not trusting her. For a moment, I felt guilty. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe I had let my imagination run wild. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next day, I decided to take a closer look. Emma always kept her phone with her, but she left it charging on the counter while she showered. My hands trembled when I picked it up. I wasn't proud of what I was doing, but I needed answers. I flipped through her messages, feeling like an intruder in my own marriage. Most of them were innocent, correspondence with coworkers, group messages with friends. But then I saw an unfamiliar name, Ryan. The messages were short but flirty. "Last night was awesome," one of them read. Another said, "Can't wait to see you again." My stomach churned. I put the phone down and walked out of the kitchen, feeling like the floor had just been ripped out from under me. I didn't say anything that night. I didn't say anything the next day either. I needed time to process what I had discovered. But one thing was clear. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I had built a life with, was keeping secrets. If there was one thing I prided myself on, it was consistency. I'm not one to rush into things or make rash decisions. I like facts, logic, and being sure of something before I act. But there was nothing reasonable or stable about what I discovered. It felt like my life was slipping out from under my feet, one small piece at a time. The day everything started to fall apart was not any special or unusual day. I was cleaning out my truck in the driveway, something I usually did on Saturdays when Emma was out with friends or working. The glove compartment was full of receipts, old insurance forms, and junk, and I decided to throw out what we didn't need. That's when I found this. A folded receipt from Bella Roma, the same overpriced Italian place I'd asked her about a couple weeks ago. At first I thought it was an old check she'd left in the truck after that supposed work dinner. But when I opened it, my stomach dropped. It was dated from the night she claimed she was delayed at work because of a campaign deadline. I stared at the total amount, $240 for 2 people, and felt the ground beneath me tilt. I couldn't shake the thought. If she lied about where she was that night, what else had she lied about? I stood still for a long time, holding that check like it was radioactive. Part of me wanted to run into the house, throw it on the table, and demand an explanation. But a calmer and more calculating part of me said, "No, don't do that. Not now. Get the whole story first." I put the receipt in my pocket and went about my business, but my mind kept whirling. That night, after Emma went to bed, I sat in the living room with my laptop and opened our shared credit card account. The more I scrolled through it, the worse it got. The dinners weren't casual, they were regular. expensive restaurants, bars, and even tickets to a Broadway show in town we'd never attended together. Then there was the boutique shopping, cologne, designer watches, men's shoes. My blood ran cold in my veins when I realized this. She wasn't just spending money behind my back. She was spending it on someone else. I couldn't let this go unchecked. I needed proof, hard evidence, before I confronted her. So I did something I never thought I would. The next morning, while Emma was in the shower, I grabbed her phone off the nightstand. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I opened her messages and scrolled through, looking for anything suspicious. It didn't take long to find one. His name was Ryan. The texts weren't explicit, but they didn't need to be. One of the messages read, "Last night was perfect. I can't stop thinking about you." Another said, "I've never met anyone who makes me feel the way you do." I felt my chest tighten. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like I'd been hit and was suffocating. I kept scrolling down the page and found more and more messages that made my stomach cramp. They'd been dating for months now, dinners out, shopping trips, weekend getaways. There were pictures. His selfies with the watch I now realized I'd paid for, a shot of them at some fancy wine bar, his arm casually around her shoulders as if he were there. I put my phone down and walked out of the bedroom. All rational thought flew out the window, replaced by anger, confusion, and a gnawing sense of betrayal I couldn't shake off. How could she do this? After everything we'd been through, everything I'd sacrificed to help her get out of a mountain of debt? I'd worked overtime, skipped vacations, put off buying things I wanted, yes, even needed, so we could build a life together. And now I found out she was using the financial freedom we'd built to spoil some kid? I didn't know much about Ryan yet, but it was clear from the reports that he was younger, probably in his early 20s. A few months ago, Emma had mentioned mentoring someone at work. I hadn't paid much attention to it at the time, but now it was clear. She wasn't mentoring him. She was dating him. The rest of the day passed like a blur. I couldn't concentrate on anything. My hands shook every time I thought about it, and my stomach felt like it was tied in a knot. That night, Emma came home from another work event, kissed me on the cheek, and acted like everything was normal. I wanted to yell at her, to tell her I knew everything, but I held back. Instead, I watched her closely, noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before. The way she was glued to her phone, the way she turned it face down on the counter, the sly smile she gave me when a text came in. It was infuriating when she acted like nothing had changed, while everything had changed. I felt like I was living in some twisted alternate reality where the person I loved and trusted was a complete stranger. I stayed up late that night, staring at the ceiling and replaying everything in my head. The lies, the money, the text messages. The image of Ryan's smug face, grinning like he'd won the lottery, was imprinted in my brain. By morning, I realized I couldn't keep pretending. I had to face her, but not now. I had to act smart, gather all the evidence I could. It wasn't just about her cheating. It was about everything: the time, the money, and the trust she'd stolen from me. I wasn't going to let her brush it off or gaslight me into thinking I'd lost my mind. I would play along with her for now. I'd smile and nod and pretend everything was okay. But deep down, I was a time bomb waiting for the right moment to blow everything up. The morning I decided to confront Emma was just like any other morning. She was sitting at the kitchen counter, sipping her coffee, flipping through her phone, and humming softly. It was the kind of mundane moment that marriages take for granted, a moment that should have been comforting. But instead, it felt like a play, and I was an unwilling spectator. All last week, I'd been gathering evidence, going through credit card statements and taking screenshots of her text with Ryan. Every time I looked at them, I felt sick to my stomach, but I couldn't stop. It was like looking at the wreckage of a wrecked car, knowing I shouldn't be looking but unable to look away. I waited until she finished her coffee and started putting the dishes away before I said anything. My voice came out smoother than I expected. "We need to talk." She looked over her shoulder, her expression curious but not concerned. "About what?" I motioned for her to take a seat at the table. She hesitated for a moment, then put her mug in the sink and joined me. "I know about Ryan," I said, watching her reaction carefully. Her face didn't immediately change. She tilted her head slightly, frowning her eyebrows as if she didn't understand. "Ryan?" she repeated, her voice very neutral. I pulled out my phone, opened the saved screenshots, and held it out to her across the table. Her eyes lowered to the screen, and for the first time, I saw her mask slip. Her expression trembled, just for a second, but it was enough. She realized she was caught. "What is it?" she asked, her voice becoming sharper. "You're going to tell me," I replied. "The messages, the dinners, the gifts. I know everything, Emma. So don't insult me by pretending you don't know what I'm talking about." She stared at the screen, her jaw clenched. Then she laughed a short, humorless sound. "You're going through my phone right now? Jesus, can you even hear yourself? This is insane." "Crazy?" I repeated, raising my voice. "What's crazy is that you're lying to me, using our money to spoil some kid, and acting like I wouldn't have a clue about it." She opened her mouth to object, but I didn't give her the chance. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a check from Bella Roma, slapping it on the table. "Explain this," I said. Her eyes darted to the check, and I could see the wheels turning in her head, trying to come up with a story. But there wasn't one. "Not this time." She sighed, leaned back in her chair, and crossed her arms. "Okay," she said in a defensive tone. "You want the truth?" "Yes, I dated Ryan. Are you happy now?" "Happy?" I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "Are you seriously asking me that?" "I don't know what you want me to say," she said, throwing up her hands. "It's not like it just happened out of nowhere. Do you have any idea how hard it was for me during those years when we were paying off debts? I felt trapped, like I was suffocating." "And you?" She shook her head, letting out a bitter chuckle. "You were so obsessed with the budget, every penny. There was no room for anything else." I stared at her, stunned. "You're blaming me for this?" "I'm not accusing anyone," she said, though her tone said otherwise. "I'm just saying it wasn't easy being married to you back then. And Ryan, he helped me feel free again." Her words came crashing down on me like a freight train. Free. That's what it was all about for her. While I was busting my ass to build our future, she was procrastinating, waiting for a way out. Our sacrifices weren't mutual, not even close. I sat there trying to comprehend her words, but the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. I'd given up so much for her, for us, and she'd used that freedom to betray me. "How much?" I asked suddenly. She frowned. "What? How much did you spend on him? Dinners, gifts, trips, how much?" She looked away, refusing to answer. That told me everything I wanted to know. I stood up, and the chair scraped loudly on the floor. "I'm going to find him," I said, grabbing my jacket. "Wait, what are you talking about?" she asked, a note of panic in her voice. "I'm talking about paying back every penny you spent on him," I said. "If he thinks he can live off my labor, he's in for a whole other thing." I didn't give her a chance to answer. I grabbed my keys and headed out the door, my blood boiling. Finding Ryan wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. A quick search of his name online turned up his Instagram profile with pictures of him wearing the watch Emma had bought him and vacationing on what I could only assume was my dime. I sent him a message that was short and to the point. "We need to talk. Meet me at the coffee shop on Main Street at 6 p.m. You'll be interested to hear what I have to say." He responded a few hours later, agreeing to meet. When I walked into the coffee shop that evening, I noticed him immediately. He was younger than me, early 20s at most, with perfectly styled hair and a smug confidence that made my fists itch. He stood up as I approached and held out his hand, but I ignored it and sat down across from him. "Do you know who I am?" I asked. He nodded, his expression wary. "You're Emma's husband." "Not for long," I said. "But that's not why I'm here." He raised an eyebrow. "Then why are you here?" "To settle debts," I said, leaning forward. "Emma spent thousands of dollars on you, my money, and you have to pay them back." He blinked, clearly caught off guard. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb," I said, my voice low and firm. "Dinners, gifts, trips, you think all that came out of her pocket? She doesn't have that kind of money. It was me. I paid for everything." He looked uncomfortable, but I didn't give up. "You're going to pay me back," I repeated. "Every single one. Every last one. Penny." "And if I don't?" he asked, trying to sound tough, but failing miserably. I smiled, though there was no humor in it. You don't want to find out. By the time I left the cafe, I had his promise to pay me back, and though I didn't quite believe him, I felt a small sense of satisfaction. It wasn't enough to erase the traces of betrayal, but it was a start. And as I drove home that evening, I realized that while Emma might have felt free with Ryan, she'd lost the one thing she'd taken for granted all along: me. The aftermath of Emma's confession wasn't like ripping off a Band-Aid. It wasn't quick, and the healing wasn't fast. Rather, it was a slow, grueling process where each day brought a new layer of frustration, anger, and resentment. For the first few days after I confronted her, we barely spoke. She slept in the guest room, which was a joke because I hardly slept at all. My mind was stuck in an endless loop of her words, her excuses, her complete lack of remorse. I felt trapped. That phrase haunted me. How could she say that after everything I'd done for her? All the sacrifices I'd made to get her out of the financial hole she'd driven herself into? She wasn't trapped. She was in my arms. And now I was the bad guy? Eventually, we couldn't avoid talking anymore. The silence became stifling, and the house began to resemble a pressure cooker. When she finally melted the ice, it wasn't to apologize. "I don't know why you act like it's all my fault alone," she said one evening, standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed. "You were obsessed with the budget. Everything we did revolved around saving money. It was exhausting." I was stunned. "Are you seriously trying to blame this on me?" I said, even though my voice had risen. "I was obsessed with the budget because I was trying to fix your mess, Emma. Or have you forgotten who racked up $40,000 in credit card debt before we were even married?" She rolled her eyes. "It's not my fault, and you know it. You never gave me a break. Every time I wanted to do something nice for myself, it turned into a big lecture about how we can't afford it." "Because we can't," I exclaimed, slamming my hand on the counter. "We were drowning in debt, Emma. What part of that don't you understand?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at me as if I was the one being unreasonable, as if I was the villain in the story. "You don't understand," she finally said, her voice quieter but still harsh. "You were so focused on the future that you forgot about the present." I felt like I was suffocating, and Ryan helped me feel alive again. At that moment, something in me broke. I didn't scream or clap my hands. I just looked at her and said, "You don't even realize how selfish you sound, do you?" Her expression hardened and she walked away, muttering something to herself that I didn't catch. It wasn't even the fights that were the worst part. It was the way those fights spread throughout our lives, dragging everyone around us into the mess. At first, I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I didn't want to endure the questions, the pitying looks, and the unsolicited advice. But Emma apparently had no such restraints. The day after our fight in the kitchen, my mom called me. "I just talked to Emma," she said, her voice cautious. "She told me about the fight. Are you okay?" My stomach rumbled. "What did she say?" I asked, tensing up. "She said that you were controlling her finances, and that she felt like she couldn't breathe." I closed my eyes, pinching the bridge of my nose. Of course, she twisted the story to make herself look like a victim. "Did she ever mention cheating on me?" I asked, straining my voice. Mom was silent for a moment. "No," she said finally. "She didn't say anything about it." I explained everything, her affair, the money she'd spent on Ryan, and the way she tried to blame me for all of it. Mom listened in silence, and when I was done, she said, "I'm so sorry. I had no idea." Her encouragement was comforting, but it didn't last long. Within days, the news spread to friends and family on both sides. And that's where the lines were drawn. Some people, mostly my family and a few close friends, were firmly on my side. They saw Emma's betrayal for what it was and said I deserved better. But others weren't so understanding. Several of Emma's friends turned on me, accusing me of being too strict, too controlling. Even some mutual friends tried to take a middle ground, saying something like, "You have to agree, the whole debt thing must have been really stressful for her." Or, "Maybe she felt she couldn't talk to you about her feelings." Every time someone defended her, it felt like another slap in the face. I wanted to yell at them, throw the evidence in their face and make them see the truth. But I didn't. I just gritted my teeth and lowered my head, trying to focus on what was coming next. The emotional blow was brutal. I found it hard to concentrate at work. I would black out during meetings and make stupid mistakes. I stopped going out with friends because I didn't want to answer their questions and feel uncomfortable. The nights were the worst. I lay in bed looking up at the ceiling and went over every argument, every accusation, every moment that had brought us here. I asked myself the same questions. How had I missed the signs? How did I let things get so bad? And then came the anger. It came in waves, unpredictable and overwhelming. One minute I was feeling good, and the next I'd see something that reminded me of Emma or Ryan, and it was like a match was lit inside me. One day I was at the grocery store and saw a couple laughing together in the produce department. The guy leaned over and kissed the girl on the forehead, and for some reason it excited me. I left my cart in the middle of the aisle and walked out of the store, my chest tense and my hands shaking. Of course, I wasn't mad at them. I was angry at what they represented, what I thought I had with Emma, but apparently never became. The tension began to take its toll on everything. My parents were constantly worried about me, calling every day to see how I was doing. My boss asked if I needed time off, even though I could tell he wasn't thrilled with the idea. Even my friends, the ones who were on my side, started to pull away, not knowing how to help. Meanwhile, Emma acted like nothing had changed. She was still hanging out with friends, still posting pictures on social media, still playing the role of the carefree, guilt-free wife. It was infuriating, watching her move on so easily while I was drowning in the wreckage she left behind. But no matter how much it hurt, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't let her win. If she thought I was going to give in to her and let her rewrite history, she was in for a rough ride. This wasn't the end, not at all. I thought I'd hit rock bottom after Emma confessed to cheating. But as it turns out, the bottom has its layers, and I was just getting started. For a while, I tried to focus on what I could control. My job, my sanity, and what crumbs of dignity I had left. I told myself that everything would make sense in the end, that chaos had some kind of endpoint. But life has a funny way of kicking you when you're down, doesn't Emma? She's been kicking for a long time, long before I realized I was in the ring. It all started with a bank statement. I was going through our joint accounts to figure out how to divide our finances. I wasn't about to let her drag me into another financial hole, especially now that I knew how reckless she could be. As I looked through the transactions, something caught my eye. A series of transfers labeled savings account. At first, this didn't strike me as unusual. We talked about getting a savings account before, for emergencies or for a down payment on a house. But the amounts didn't add up. Transfers were irregular, often large sums that didn't fit into any of the agreed budgets. And the dates? Some of them were from years ago, when we were still paying off her debts. A wistful feeling settled in my gut. I knew Emma had spent money recklessly during their affair, but this was something else. This was deliberate. I logged into online banking and tried to find the account. To no avail. It wasn't linked to any of our mutual profiles. And then it hit me. It wasn't just a savings account. It was a secret account she'd opened behind my back. My hands were shaking as I called the bank, pretending to be Emma to get more information. I know it wasn't exactly ethical, but at this point I didn't care about ethics. I cared about the truth. The representative confirmed my suspicions. Emma had opened a separate account in her name over 3 years ago. 3 years. That was long before her affair began. I tried to make sense of the situation. Why would she hide the money from me? What was she using it for? I requested a transaction history and waited impatiently for the letter to arrive. When it finally arrived, I opened it with the dread you feel before you peel off a bandage. The first few transactions revealed nothing much. Transfers from our joint account, a few small withdrawals. But then I saw them. Payments to expensive stores, luxury travel agencies, and, worst of all, wire transfers to someone named Ryan McAllister. I stared at that name, my brain struggling to comprehend. Ryan, her boyfriend. The pattern was undeniable. Emma was transferring money into this secret account and using it to fund her boyfriend's lifestyle. Trips to Napa Valley, designer clothes, expensive electronics, all things I could never afford to splurge on because I was too busy working overtime to pay off her credit card debt. I sat in stunned silence, my anger building with every line I read. She was playing me for a fool. using my hard work to fund her fantasy life with some guy who probably didn't even know how to hold down a steady job. The chronology of transactions painted an even uglier picture. Emma had started transferring money into this account at a time when we were still living on a shoestring, cutting corners and making sacrifices to get out of debt. I thought we were a team, but she was biding her time, siphoning off money and preparing for life without me. The betrayal was overwhelming. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was years of lies, years of selfishness disguised as partnership. She had taken advantage of my trust, my loyalty, and my willingness to sacrifice herself for our future. And for what? To play sugar mama for some boy who probably didn't care about her except for what she could buy him. I felt like I was suffocating, like the walls of my home, our home, were closing in around me. This wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage. It was a betrayal of everything I thought we stood for, everything I thought I aspired to. I wanted to confront her right here and now, shove the bank statements in her face and demand answers. But something was stopping me. Maybe fatigue. Maybe the realization that no answer from her would be enough. She'd already shown me who she was. Instead, I started making plans. If she wanted to play dirty, I would play it smarter. The next day, I contacted my lawyer and laid everything out. Her affair, the secret account, the money she had stolen. After listening to me, the lawyer expressed pity and anger. "We're going to need the documents," she said. "I have them," I replied, pulling out my bank statements. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of control. I couldn't change what Emma had done, but I could make sure she didn't get away with it. That night I sat in the living room and looked at the wedding picture on the mantel. We looked so happy in that picture, full of hope and promise. I wanted to smash it, throw it across the room, and watch it shatter into a million pieces. But I didn't. Instead, I placed it face down on the table, walked over to the refrigerator, and grabbed a beer. As I sat in silence, the weight of everything that was happening came over me. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was heartbroken. My heart was broken from the person I used to be, someone who believed in love, in trust, in building a life together. Now that person was gone, replaced by someone tougher, someone who wouldn't be fooled again. Emma took so much from me, and she won't take any more. I'll take care of it. Filing for divorce was like ripping the bandage off a gaping wound. It didn't stop the bleeding. It just made the pain sharper, more immediate. But it was necessary. Staying in this marriage longer would be like trying to build a house on a crumbling foundation. The day I signed the papers, I didn't feel relieved. I felt tired. Sitting in my lawyer's office and staring at the stack of forms that spelled out the end of everything Emma and I had built, or what I thought we had built, was surreal. The lawyer, a shallow woman named Andrea, looked at me with sympathy and determination. "You're doing the right thing," she said. "But it's not going to be easy. She's coming for everything." And she wasn't kidding. Emma didn't just want to break up. She wanted to take the house, the cars, the savings, everything. Her lawyer claimed she'd sacrificed her career to support me, while missing the point that I was working myself to exhaustion paying off her debts while she transferred money into a secret account. It was infuriating. I'd built our financial stability from the ground up, often to the detriment of my own happiness. Now Emma was trying to take it all away, making up a story to make herself look like a victim. The court battles were brutal. Each hearing felt like a new betrayal, with Emma sitting across the room with her lawyer and painting me as a controlling tyrant who didn't appreciate her victims. My lawyer fought back hard, using the evidence I had gathered of her cheating, secret spending, and complete disregard for the financial partnership we had supposedly built together. But even when the truth was on my side, the system didn't make it easy for me. Divorce is a torturous endeavor, and dividing assets feels more like war than negotiation. Every argument about who gets what hurt me. The house was the hardest. I didn't want to stay in it, too many bad memories. But the thought of Emma getting it was like a punch in the gut. This house was my dream. I worked overtime, skipped vacations, and put off countless small pleasures to afford it. Eventually, a judge ruled that we would have to sell it and split the proceeds. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but at least she wouldn't be able to keep it. Another blow was the financial strain. The legal fees were piling up fast, and selling the house meant finding a new place to live, which wasn't cheap. I ended up renting a small apartment on the outskirts of town, a far cry from the home I had once envisioned raising a family in. I also sold my truck, trading it in for a used sedan that fit into my tighter budget. Each step was a reminder of how much I had lost, how much I had sacrificed for a man who didn't appreciate me. But amidst the wreckage, there was also a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in years, I wasn't living under the weight of Emma's expectations or her manipulations. The betrayal still stung, but it also made me take a hard look at myself, at the person I'd become in this marriage. I realized that I had spent so much time trying to solve her problems that I had ignored my own needs. I was letting her financial turmoil, her moods and lies dictate my life. In retrospect, the warning signs were there. I just didn't want to notice them. The divorce was finalized after 8 grueling months. Emma didn't get everything she wanted, but she got more than she deserved. We split the savings and sold the house, splitting the profits. She kept her car and I kept mine. It wasn't a clean win, but it was a win nonetheless. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of her lies, her betrayal, and our broken marriage had finally been lifted off my shoulders. But the road ahead was not easy. Trust no longer came naturally. Every relationship, every interaction was clouded by suspicion. I plunged headlong into work, not because I loved it, but because it gave me something to focus on, something to recover. Slowly, piece by piece, I began to put my life back together. I found a new apartment that felt like mine, not a shadow of what I had lost. I reconnected with friends I had become estranged from during my marriage, and I started going to therapy to untangle the mess Emma had left in my head. Looking back, I can say that the lessons were painful but necessary. I learned through experience that love alone is not enough to sustain a relationship. You need trust, respect, and honesty, all things that Emma had systematically destroyed. I also learned to value myself more. I had spent so much of my marriage bending to Emma's needs, her debts, her dramas, that I had forgotten I deserved more. Now I'm focused on building a life for myself that doesn't revolve around other people's chaos. It's not glamorous, and it's not easy, but it's mine. Every now and then I think about Emma and wonder if she regrets what she did. But those thoughts don't linger like they used to. She's a chapter in my life that's now closed, and I'm finally ready to move on. As for trust, that's going to take time. I don't know if I'll ever fully regain it, but I'm at peace with it. Because for the first time in a long time, I'm living for myself, and it feels like freedom.